Good morning, Garland Nixon here, and the great and brilliant Joti Brar is back with us. We got lots of things to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, and once again, one of my favorite guests, and certainly based on the feedback I get on the channel, one of the favorite guests of a lot of our members of the chat. I always learn a lot. You know me, I love to learn. That's what life's about for me, and I learn a lot from Joti. She's studied some very important works for many years, and she's always able to apply that knowledge to things that are going on in the world today. So let's start with this, something that I know very little about, the UK elections. The only thing I know, this is the only thing I'll throw in about that, and it's not about the UK elections. There's the discussion in the US often now is this, the uni-party. Oh, the Republicans and the Democrats, they have a pillow fight and they want to make us believe it's a knife fight. They're arguing over little things and, silly, literally. They were in Congress. Someone was saying, one of the members of Congress were saying, your eyelashes are screwing up your ability to see things. And the other was like, oh, well, you're a bleach blonde fat person or something crazy, right? The SPD and the Christian Democrats, whoever, in the Greens in Germany, 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other, as they say. And now people are like, oh boy, we get to go from Sunak to Starmer. Boy, that's going to be a dramatic, change of events. Your thoughts on politics in England, the elections in England, and that particular concept that I'm talking about that we're seeing throughout the Western capitalist countries, throughout, as I say, the US empire and its colonies. Joti.
Yeah, the uni-party, absolutely. You're talking about this kind of drama that's presented to us as if the kind of fake debates and fake controversies, which are massaged for our entertainment, essentially, and distraction, are something real and meaningful. What you described there, I would call it handbags at dawn, right? This idea that there's something of real substance going on, when in fact it's a scrap over things that have no relevance to anything. It's a sideshow to a sideshow to a sideshow, right? You and I have talked before about the fact that Parliament itself, the government itself, is not where decisions are made. The government is the executive body for the ruling class. The Parliament doesn't actually impact the decisions of the government. The Parliament, where we elect our representatives, who, after running around and auditioning for us, in the press for a few minutes at election time, go off and do precisely as they please for the next 4 or 5 years. So much for representing us, right? Us, the workers, the idiots who vote. Our elected representatives are, they're in this talking shop where they shout at each other and have controversies over nothing much and have all these kind of arcane procedures about the rules of how they do their debating. But they're not actually discussing how the country is run, and they're certainly not deciding how the country is run. For example, a law that gets passed in Parliament, okay, so that impacts how the country is run to an extent, right? But who drafted that law? Well, if you look at some of the processes, what you find is lobby groups draft laws, and then they get MPs, who they sponsor, to sponsor the bill through Parliament. That's one of the methods. The government can draft a law through Whitehall. And remember, Whitehall is the civil service. The civil service is the permanent government. That is why in Belgium recently, they had this extended period where there was no government. And there was no problem either, right? Nothing was interrupted because the civil service is the one that runs the country administratively day to day, and they're all still there, right? Now, the civil service, the top civil servants come from the right families, the right schools. They are utterly impeccable status quo people, and you didn't elect any of them, and you don't know any of their names, right? They're the ones who are advising ministers on what and what isn't possible, practicable, etc., etc. And they are the interface, actually, or one of the interfaces between the government, the ministers, the parliament, and the big business, who are the ones who are really making the decisions, right? And the very, very super, super rich, they have their personal networks, and they know the top civil servants. They drink with them in the clubs, and all of that, and the top generals, and so there's this interlocking ruling class that is not elected, not known, not featured in the gossip pages, not featured in the newspapers. We don't see them or the mechanisms by which they exert their authority. So Parliament is a talking shop, right? It's not a means for changing the country. That is a myth for us idiots. But when it comes to election time, the elections are the way the ruling class kind of massages the people it wants to be in number 10 Downing Street, which is, the Prime Minister's house, and to make sure that that basically things will continue as they need them to continue, right? We need this charade of democracy to keep the masses engaged and to keep them feeling that the status quo has some legitimacy, that we chose our leaders, and if we don't like them, we can choose different ones, right? That's what we're always told, isn't it? If you don't like your leaders, you should vote for different ones. And if, it's your fault. If you didn't vote, then you can't complain about how the country's run. And if you do vote, well, you voted wrong, and vote differently next time, and that will change everything, right? And of course, this is not true, but this is what we're told. And it's part of how social peace is maintained, right? We have this idea that the whole thing is democratic and therefore legitimate. And the workings of what's really happening are not shown to us. We are shown the politicians, right? And the politicians' job is, on the one hand, to do as they're told by big business. That's who they really serve. But on the other hand, to put on this charade for the electorate that they are responsive to public opinion. Now, of course, the whole thing about public opinion is what the newspapers tell us it is. Who knows what public opinion really is? When they do polls, we don't understand the methodology of who they ask and how they ask them. The questions are always loaded. The segment of the population that they ask is skewed. The reason for asking the question always has an agenda behind it, right? So the whole thing about consulting public opinion, they're all just mechanisms by which to let the politicians know what they have to be doing and what they should be shouting about and how they should best audition to keep their job as, distractor of the masses, right? And executor of the ruling class agenda. So we have this situation that's very useful for the ruling class of two main parties of power. And what happens is, when one party has been in power for a while, it's become very unpopular, for obvious reasons, that they enact the policies of the ruling class that don't favour the workers. So after a while, the workers are like, I hate this government. When they came in, they promised all kinds of things, but we've just had like 5-10 years of absolute rubbish, and I'm sick, and we've had loads of scandals about how corrupt they are and this and that and the other, and we've had enough of them. And so, yay, there's another party of power waiting in the wings to take over, who can, pretend to have a clean reputation and come in making lots of promises, and there's a changing of the guard. The actual agenda pursued is exactly the same agenda. In our country, the Tory party has been a party of government for a couple of 100 years, more than that. The Labour Party took over from the old Liberal Party. They were the Whigs, then they were called the Liberals. Then the Liberals basically died at the turn of the century, in the beginning of the era of imperialism, actually. And the Labour Party took over. And the promise of the Labour Party was that it was going to represent the interests of the growing and rising working class. And the working class had for a long time had this idea that they should have a voice in Parliament. And what's interesting is that the second the working class did start to have elected working class representatives in Parliament, whatever shred of meaning there was in the debates of Parliament, you kind of rapidly vanished. You know, you're looking at the era of monopoly capital. So more and more, the ruling class was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? But more powerful because of how amazingly rich it was. And at the same time, you've got this growing demand of the workers to be represented in the institutions. And so with these two things happening at the same time, you see this development where Parliament becomes a total irrelevance to the actual decision-making process. At the same time, our very first Labour government was in 1924, and it only lasted, I think, 8-10 months. And the leader was Ramsay MacDonald. And his main aim, so there was this great hope, like, oh, like finally at last, you know, we're going to have a working class government, and they're socialists and they're going to do great things for the British working class. The main aim of that first Labour government, in the words of Ramsay MacDonald himself, was to prove to the ruling class that the empire was safe in our hands. That's his actual words, right? So if you want to know the loyalties of the Labour Party, look no further than its first leader, Ramsay MacDonald, right? The empire is safe in our hands. That was his motto in 1924. And it has remained the motto, the goal of the imperialist Labour Party ever since. The Labour Party was always a party which represented the interests of the privileged elite in the working class, not the masses. So the Labour Party makes a lot of noise about its traditional links to the trade union movement. And the trade unions in their turn say, we built the Labour Party, we founded it, we created it so that workers would have parliamentary representation. But what they leave out is the fact that the Labour movement, the trade unions, which founded the Labour Party as a representation committee for the unions in Parliament, were the craft unions. So at that time in Britain, there were two sets of trade unions, if you like. There were the old ones, which represented the interests of skilled, well-paid Labour aristocrats, as Lenin called them, the elite of the working class. And the masses of the working class were unrepresented for a long time. And then they started to create what were called general unions. There was a movement called New Unionism in the 1880s, which founded, you know, a bunch of new general unions for the mass of the working class. That was, you know, Engels at the time. Engels was Karl Marx's kind of comrade in arms and co-founder of scientific socialism. He was very excited at the birth of New Unionism and thought that something was going to change in the working class movement. But very quickly, the leadership of these unions got co-opted in the same old way. And so the loyalties of the leaders of the trade union movement and of the craft unions which founded the Labour Party was right from the beginning preserving British imperialism, which was the root of the privilege of that section of the working class, which you and I have talked about this before, right? So when we look at this dance and this game and this kind of PR presentation of Labour and Tory, what we actually see is two parties which have exactly the same programme. In fact, we've got more parties than two in Britain which have the same programme, but we have two main ones. Everyone knows the government's going to be one or the other, right? Which makes a lot of voting in our country a bit bloody pointless, because you can have a whole load of candidates on the ballot paper, but you know, in most places, your vote's going to be totally wasted unless it's for, you know, Tory or Labour. Occasionally, you know, Lib Dem is the second out of three instead of the third, but, you know, it's like that. So because we have a first past the post and a very massaged and gerrymandered system where they set the lines of voting areas to make sure that the balance is kept a certain way, every aspect of our process in Britain is very controlled. And what that means is pretty much the ruling class will decide who's going to win an election. They can decide it through the press. They can decide it through the electoral boundaries. They can decide it through, you know, they're the ones who select all the candidates for all the parties, right? I mean, there's lots of scandals in the Labour Party, endlessly scandals in the Labour Party, because they're supposed to have this democratic selection process. And yet, when it comes to it, head office is who actually decides who the candidates are going to be, and who tells head office of the Labour Party who the candidates are going to be. You know, you can see that coming through all the time. I have an experience personally of this with Keir Starmer, in fact, because he's not been in the Labour Party that long. He's not a career politician. He was the chief prosecutor. What do they call it? I forget the name. Sorry, it's gone out of my head. Anyways, he was the chief prosecutor for the state in Britain for quite a long time. Before that, he was supposed to be a human rights lawyer. Try not to laugh. But he was our man. He was a good man. He'd showed himself in his job in the prosecutor's office as the right type of a guy, right? He's an arch Zionist, and he's been auditioning on his knees to be allowed the job of PM for a long time. So, you know, he's one of them. They've chosen him. They've massaged him into power. I was living in Camden Town many years ago, which is part of Keir Starmer's constituency, Holborn and St Pancras, back when Frank Dobson, the health minister, Labour health minister, was the MP there. And I stood against him for the Socialist Labour Party. I don't know what votes I got, 3.5. But for Arthur Scargill's Socialist Labour Party, like however long ago that was, more than 20 years ago, 24 or 5 years ago. And sometime after that, I remember there were murmurings that would come to me through the grapevine about what was happening in the local Labour Party and how this new guy was going to be adopted as a candidate for MP in the area, and how the powers that be at the top of the Labour Party saw him as a prime ministerial candidate. And this was Keir Starmer. So right from the very beginning, when he was being brought in, there were these whispers like, somebody wants this guy, you know. So I've been aware of that the whole time his career's been going on. It's like there's some powerful people somewhere who have decided that this guy will be a good prime minister. And right now, it's a very important moment for the ruling class to get a stable Labour government elected. You know, the Tories have been in power a long time. They're very discredited. Their corruption and the fact that they've presided over so many horrible things, right? You know, they presided over the Brexit, first of all, the Brexit fiasco and not getting Brexit done, then the promising to get Brexit done, but not really. Then obviously COVID and everything that went with that. And, you know, all these years of austerity since 2008 banking crisis, which, you know, there was a study a few years back that said, you know, they could connect about 120,000 unnecessary deaths to the austerity program. And I'm sure that's a massive understatement. But, you know, the poverty that's been inflicted on workers since 2008, you know, a lot of people associate that not with the ruling class, not with capitalism, but with the Tories, right? So for many, many reasons, the Tories have become extremely unpopular. And, you know, with the cost of living crisis, you know, going absolutely crazy, inflation going crazy, the government keeps telling us that, oh, inflation's getting better now. But ordinary people will tell you something quite different about, you know, how far their pay packet goes every month. And every single month they're feeling a downward tip, you know, and the prices of everything keep going up. The prices of rent, the price of fuel, the price of essential foods, the price of all the things your kids need for school, you know, of your bus pass, your rail fares. It now costs me to get on a train that takes 1 hour, 20 minutes into London and back, costs me now £100 off peak. Yep. If I want to go to London for the day on an off peak, so not in the rush hour, in the rush hour, it's like 150 quid. If I want to go off peak, it will cost me £100 to go to London and back in the day. And that's a 1 hour, 20-minute train ride. So, you know, things are not getting cheaper for ordinary people, right? And they wonder why we have to stay in our cars. So it's clear the ruling class wants a Labour government now to take over, and particularly because things are going to keep getting worse for the working class. Things like the inflation crisis is not going anywhere. The economic crisis is going to get worse, not better in the coming period. And the war drive is accelerating also. So to try to keep a lid on all of this, Labour is the preferred party, precisely because the trade unions can be relied on to back it. Now, I remember, again, the same thing happened through the Tony Blair period. No matter what crimes Tony Blair's government and Gordon Brown's, which followed it, were committing in the world or against the working class at home, the line of the trade union leaders was, don't cause a fuss, don't rock the boat, because you'll let the Tories back in. And this is the game they play with us, like, oh, Labour is the best you can get as a worker, so you better pray for a Labour government. When the Tories are in, we're told that the cure for every single problem is to get a Labour government in. And when a Labour government is in, we are told, don't rock the boat, because you'll get the Tories back. The Tories being like this, the bogeyman, and Labour being somehow, no matter what they do, no matter what crime they commit, Labour is presented to us as the friend of the working class. And so it's very clear, I think, that the ruling class wants Labour in, and they want a stable Labour government. They want Labour with a big landslide and a majority. So all the press are telling us Labour's going to get a landslide, everybody hates the Tories. Labour's going to get a landslide, everybody hates the Tories. And that's part of the way they kind of tell us how to vote. Right? They tell us that Keir Starmer's going to be a good prime minister. They tell us he's got lots of good ideas. They tell us I'm going to get her name wrong, so I won't say it because I get them muddled up. I get some of the Labour drones muddled up. His shadow chancellor, the woman who will be the Chancellor of the Exchequer if Labour are elected, just announced that she wants to run the most business-friendly Labour government ever. I mean, that's up against some pretty stiff competition. And that's in a situation where it's not businesses that need help. It's the working class. It's the working class that's been absolutely screwed in the last 15 years. It's desperate. You know, we have horrific anti-union legislation in this country, very hard for workers to defend their rights or stand up for themselves, draconian, kind of anti-protest laws, and horrifically decaying public services and decaying terms, conditions, pay, pensions. Everything about working class life has got drastically worse in the last 15 years. And we've been told that the answer to all of this is a Labour government. But already Labour are presenting themselves as to business. They're auditioning to the business leaders and saying, don't worry about us. We're going to be totally pro-business. Don't worry about those workers' rights things we said, we talked about before. We'll give them a new name and then we put them down our priority list. And actually, they're not that important to us. Don't worry about that. We just have to say that to get votes. And the radical trade union leaders go along to the head office of the Labour Party and say, that doesn't sound too good to us. And basically the Labour whips say, get in line. And they go, okay, we're in line. Every single radical trade union leader in Britain who was talking a good fight 3 years ago is now lining up to back Keir Starmer, the arch Zionist who has said that it was okay, Mr. Human Rights Lawyer, who said in public back in December or November or whenever it was, that it was acceptable for Israel to do what it had to do to crush Hamas, right? Not the Palestinian people, including cutting off water and energy to Gaza, 2 million people. It's okay. That's okay, said human rights lawyer, arch Zionist Labour Party leader Keir Starmer. These radical, pro-working class, allegedly, trade union leaders are lining up to endorse this man and his party, all the war crimes it's committed in the last 30 years. And they're all lining up to say, well, we have to get the Tories out and we have to back Keir Starmer no matter what. It's in the interest of workers. How it's supposed to be in the interest of workers, I have never seen any of them make a cogent argument for it. They just say it. It's going to be better than the Tories. I beg to differ, personally. As you said, it's a uni-party. It's a massive fraud on the people. And I think the mass of people have actually worked that out, because during the last 40 years of steady deindustrialization, loss of industrial jobs in Britain, those people in the Labour Party did nothing to halt that decline or even sort of complain about it. In areas where traditional working class industrial areas where people voted Labour for their MPs and for their councils, traditionally, almost as a religion for decades since World War II, or even since the First World War, have stopped voting Labour because they found that their Labour representatives, their Labour councils didn't save a library. Their Labour MPs did nothing to save an industry, a factory, not even a job, not even a library, book. Those Labour representatives just kept their noses in the gravy train, their snouts in the trough, while the areas they were supposed to represent were left to rot. And huge numbers of working class people have stopped voting Labour. Many of them have stopped voting at all. And I think it's because they have realised that, I know it is, because I've talked to them on the doorsteps when I've gone canvassing. What is the point? They are all the same, these politicians. It doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same result. And this is a correct conclusion. This is not apathy. It is cynicism. We have not yet moved from a cynical approach to politics to a demand for working class politics. This is the gap that we still have to jump with a lot of these people. But I think their conclusion that there's nothing to be got from the parliament, that there's no point turning out to parliamentary elections, and that Labour and Tory are all the same, are absolutely correct. And what we do with that then is another thing. And just lastly, on the question of the elections, I do think that we should point out that since voting, as they say, if voting changed anything, they'd have abolished it. Since voting is not going to change the system, it's not going to get us the things that we need. We can't affect the real levers of power through the bourgeois parliament. Is there any point voting? Many times I would say, no, there isn't. We've just got to organise the alternative. But in this particular juncture, with the genocide ongoing, and almost all of our parliamentarians, with the honourable exception of George Galloway right now, complicit in this genocide, then there's a wave of independent candidates being put up who are anti-Labour Party and anti-genocide. And I would say, if you have a candidate like that standing in your area who is specifically standing against Labour, against the genocide, against NATO and all its wars, then I would say do vote for that for two reasons. Number one, to send a message to the ruling class that this issue of Palestine and the genocide is not going to go away, to send a message to the rest of the working class that we need to do more. But also, I would really like to see a result out of this election whereby Labour lose enough votes from enough people that they don't get the stable majority that they want to just run things their way. What I would like, the ruling class's way. I think the workers of Britain can best be served by an unstable political situation in Parliament, a hung Parliament, a difficult job for Starmer to form a government, and all of that to deepen the political crisis at this time when the ruling class is trying to accelerate its war drive, is backing this genocide in Gaza and trying to kick off wars, in all other many corners of the globe. I think that denying them the ability for a stable regime in the political sphere is worth doing.
I certainly agree with you there. Let's move on. That was great. I learned a lot about British politics, but also I think those things are applicable in the U.S. As I was listening, I was like, boy, that sounds just like us, which, should be something that we all learn from. Let's talk about the ICC and Netanyahu. But a quick thought on that. I looked at it and I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. I mean, just speaking of the charges, if I were to get attacked by a criminal, and the court was going to say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to charge you, the victim, and the criminal. And we're only going to start discussing the jury can only hear evidence from the time that you started fighting back against the person who was robbing. When they actually started the crime, we can't talk about that. Only start from the time you started fighting back against the criminal. And we'll say, well, there was a fight between two people, leaving out the fact that one of them, was robbing the other. It's kind of absurd to me. There's a lot of absurdities. There are people who are saying, yeah, this is great. At least there's some level of culpability. Well, I've got my issues with the whole thing. But then, of course, the Netanyahu people and the U.S., the imperialists in the U.S., we've got to threaten the ICC. We've got to discredit the puppet organization that we've been using to prosecute, with the exception of Slobodan Milosevic, the African leaders or the people in the countries that, we want to take out. Your thoughts on this dynamic?
Definitely, Garland. You summed up a lot of it really nicely there, I have to say. I would like to highlight the origins of the ICC. And the reason for doing that is because a lot of young people I meet came into a world where people talk about the International Criminal Court and they make an assumption that it's a universally accepted international body with credibility. But if you're as old as we are, you know that it isn't, right? Now, I remember when they founded the precursor to the ICC, which was called, it's the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, right? They specifically set up a kangaroo court in The Hague to try the leader of Yugoslavia who resisted the imperialist destruction of his country. And for resisting the imperialist destruction of his country, he was tried as a war criminal at The Hague by this kangaroo court. And I remember that whole process. I was kind of in my earlier days of political awareness, but I was paying attention to that process. And I remember how they shut down the court because Milosevic, President Milosevic, who was the leader of Yugoslavia at the time of the Yugoslav war, he was basically kidnapped, taken to The Hague. He was kept in conditions where his health really materially was deteriorating all the time, but he represented himself in that court. And he did a really, really good job, to the point where they stopped broadcasting and then they stopped holding the sessions altogether. And then he mysteriously died because they weren't getting the PR wins they wanted out of it. He kept bringing up really embarrassing facts and points. And that's something for anybody is worth looking into. Some of the transcripts from that trial and what really went on there. Go back and look at it and find out, where did the ICC begin? It was this kangaroo court, right? And after that, there was this Rome statute or whatever. There was some kind of, a cobbling together of imperialist powers and their proxies around the world signed up for this Rome statute that established the International Criminal Court. Now, what's interesting to me is, why was the International Criminal Court needed when there's already an ICJ at the UN, right? That actually is officially signed up to by every member of the United Nations, right? Part of their structures should be the body, right? So clearly it was felt by the imperialists that this body wasn't quite controllable enough, even though, as we see, this body is essentially toothless, because when the ICJ makes a verdict, then it's up to the Security Council to implement it, and the USA goes veto and nothing happens. Right? So even though they have that veto mechanism, the PR situation is such they can't use it the way they would like to every time. And if you look at the ICC since its establishment in the mid-2000s, the only people it's tried were Africans who'd got on the wrong side of the imperialists for some reason or another. I mean, it's like a punishment beating place. And then they then hold these up as, this guy's done war crimes, this guy's done war crimes, and if you look into any of the cases, you will find some guy being held responsible for crimes which are actually to be laid at imperialism's door. Just like Milosevic and his members of his government were being held accountable for the crimes of imperialism in breaking up and inciting war between the peoples of the former Yugoslavia, right? Peoples who lived in harmony for, I have to count, 40 years, quite happily under socialism, as soon as the USSR collapsed, the first target, literally the USSR hadn't finished its counter-revolution when Germany and the USA were intervening in Yugoslavia to start to turn, the peoples within that country against one another and to start breaking bits of it apart. And they broke it into its constituent republics. It was always a federal republic, that had 6 republics within it. And the imperialists were absolutely set on making sure that there wasn't a strong Yugoslavia there. So that's how the ICC was founded, right? I just think that's an important bit of history and context for people to realize when they look at the ICC. It's never had a shred of legitimacy. It's never been a meaningful international body. Russia and China have never signed up to it for exactly the reasons that I've said, that it has no legitimacy. It was part of this whole rules-based international order when the imperialists were busy saying, well, F the UN, basically. We don't need the UN. We've got other ways. We can do what we want without them. But they wanted to retroactively kind of give a blessing to some of their activities in Yugoslavia. So they set up this tribunal. And recently they've done this announcement, actually through the UN, tragically, of a yearly memorial day for the Srebrenica genocide. Sorry if I don't pronounce that correctly, but the Srebrenica genocide essentially is a fiction. A lot of mass killings happened in Yugoslavia during those wars, but the narrative that says a mass killing in Srebrenica took place, which was carried out by Russians and Serbs against Bosniaks, that is a lie. That, again, is a lie which was established by the ICTY in its propaganda campaign against Milosevic and his government, the people who stood up to the imperialist destruction of Yugoslavia. Right? So again, we're seeing today a new part of this genocide. We project our crimes onto our victims, is how imperialism works, right? And the fact that they are doing this while they are carrying out an actual genocide in the full glare of publicity and protecting the people on the ground and arming them. Every day, a boat and a plane of weapons turns up from the USA to Israel to keep that bombardment going. And we've seen the latest horrific pictures coming about that. So I think the pressure builds up, even in these puppet institutions, because of the force of the resistance on the ground. Fundamentally, it's resistance that breaks the narrative. Resistance pushes its way through. When wars don't end quickly, the narrative is harder and harder to control because facts leak out, images come out. And of course, in these days of social media, images are coming out fast and furious if you want to go and look for them. And as much as the mainstream media tries to hide from that reality, anybody who wants to get plugged into that stream of information can do so, can find it and can see for themselves what's really going on. And so you have this kind of contradiction, because since there is such a thing as an international criminal court, however kangaroo it is, it's going to come under pressure from people. Well, there's this crime going on. In fact, the investigation of the ICC into, I think what they called it, the situation in Palestine, began 10 years ago. It didn't begin in October the 7th. They've been carrying out an investigation for 10 years. And just this week in The Guardian, the London Guardian, there was an investigation published which showed how, for the entirety of that, I think 9 years, the Zionists have been targeting, bugging, harassing, blackmailing members and leaders of that investigation to try to get them to stop. They were obsessed with making them stop, even though it's a tame court, even though it can't really do anything against anybody in Israel. They have always been aware that one of their strongest suits is the public relations facade that Israel and its backers in the West have presented to the world about the only democracy in the Middle East, and how facts on the ground, the persistence of the Palestinian resistance is chipping away at the credibility, chipping away at the foundations of their good standing, the good standing of Israel in the world. And that was already a problem 10 years ago. And of course, now it's exploded and it's never coming back. They're never getting legitimacy back. They're never going to be anything other. For as long as there's an Israel, it will be a pariah. There's no way back from that now. But we see this outrage, and it's really, I see it as a, what's that word? Impotent rage. But with that impotent rage, you know, it's that unreasoning, impotent rage leads people to issue these really kind of terrifying threats, right? So we had, first of all, before we were listening to the Israelis say, we'll come for you, we had this letter, didn't we, a month ago from 12 congressmen in the USA saying to the ICC, if you do this, you'll be targeted, all your assets and your family, you'll never be allowed in the States. You have been warned. Like, that's literally how they signed off their letter. You have been warned, like members of the mafia, right? And then we hear about all of this bugging and blackmailing that's been going on by the Zionists against the ICC prosecutors for 10 years. And then we have this kind of burst, another burst of outrage from the Israelis, from their backers in the West. How dare you, they say, how dare you say there's an equivalence between Hamas and us? We're a state, we're a legitimate democracy, they're terrorists. Well, of course, as you point out, Garland, how dare they actually present the oppressed and the oppressor as equivalent? The truth of the matter is, all the rights are on the side of the Palestinians, including on the side of the banned terrorist organization Hamas. Why? Because Hamas is part of the Palestinian people's national liberation movement. It's part of their just resistance to illegal occupation and repression. And in international law, the right to bear arms against your occupier and oppressor is enshrined. The Israelis, who are illegally occupying Palestine, have no rights. Their right is you may withdraw and you may pay reparations. That is it. Those are the rights that Israel has in this case. So all of the outrage, how dare you, how dare you, how dare you, is a kind of, it's a frustration, and it's an impotent frustration at the fact that the narrative has spun away from them and the truth is coming out, as truth will. I mean, it's taken a long time, Garland, and it's been building for such a long time. You know, back at the time when Israel attacked the boats that were trying to break the siege of Gaza, and you wouldn't believe it's like 10 years ago. But I remember writing at the time and thinking, Israel's days are over now. And yet somehow they sort of seem to cobble together a kind of, you know, another period of what looked from the outside like calm. But of course, the Palestinian resistance, the Palestinian people's determination to get their freedom has never gone away. And that is the real driving force of all the changes we're seeing. And this builds towards the end of the legitimacy and ultimately the end of the existence of Israel is an unstoppable historical, you know, process. And we are seeing, I think, coming to a real kind of culmination at this point.
Related to that, great stuff. I learned a lot about the ICC, and I'm sure a lot of other people did. So I'll be able to utilize that on some of my other radio shows and pick up a little bit of it. Very, very, very important points of discussion here. Yemen, the Ansar Allah, they have expanded their operations. They're now hitting Mediterranean ships in the Mediterranean. Your thoughts about the Ansar Allah movement and the importance of the role they're playing in this current conflict in West Asia?
It's a really good question. And, you know, I think there are a multitude of really important points, really important roles, that the Yemeni people are playing on so many levels. Because on the one hand, they are showing what real solidarity looks like. We refuse to allow the genocide to continue, and we will physically disrupt and we'll put our lives on the line to do it, and everything we have on the line to do it. We will physically disrupt the Zionist war machine in any way we can. So that's one. They are showing to the workers of the world what non-cooperation really looks like. In the process, they are massively exposing the total inaction and, in fact, complicity of most of the Arab states, who do nothing. Some of them talk good words. Some of them pretend to cut ties or pretend to cut supplies, but let them carry on all the same. You know, in behind closed doors, you know, it's business as usual. So they're being exposed. And the anger of the people of the Middle East is being thus further fueled from two directions. And on the other hand, the confidence of people everywhere who oppose imperialism is growing because of the actions of Ansar Allah. Because what do we see? Number one, although they're poor, they are determined, and they have shown that they will not be beaten. So that gives us all a lesson, doesn't it? It's not about how rich you are. It's about, can you unify your forces and point them all in the same direction? Because if you can, the imperialists cannot stop you. That's a really important lesson to all of us. Number two way that they're boosting all of our confidence is, we've talked about this before. US empire, like the British Empire, the imperialists are, of course, they had technological dominance, which started to be smashed with the Soviet Union, has been again smashed by China, and technology is leeching around the world, and the technological dominance is being shown to be over. But more than that, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the USA dominated the seas and it dominated the skies. And what have Ansar Allah done? They have made the seas accessing Israel unpassable to ships that are either Israeli or allied with Israel or helping Israel in any way. Unpassable. So that sea dominance has been totally exposed. It's not what it was. It's not what everybody thought it was. All these huge aircraft carriers, and they have to get out of the way for fear of being hit, because they run out of anti-aircraft missiles, and then they're sitting ducks. And then they are however many $1 billion, you know, what would you call just a floating target. It's like that US senator described the US F-35s as $1 billion paperweights. Right? Suddenly, the reality of this system and its apparent overwhelming firepower is exposed. The other dominance they have was in the air. And what's happening? Okay, the Yemenis, like the Hezbollah, don't have an air force, but they're mastering the use of cheap drones, and it's equalizing the airspace picture. Ansar Allah have brought down 6 Reaper drones. 6. These things cost a fortune to make, and they're crucial to American domination of the skies. They're part of how they work out where to fire, where the targets are, what's going on, part of their whole surveillance thing. They're supposed to be, you know, the absolute bee's knees in terms of, you know, dominating the airspace of the battlefield. And Ansar Allah, the guys in the mountains with the flip-flops and the Kalashnikovs, have brought down 6 of them, right? So this is serious. And this shows you how the balance of forces in the world is shifting. The drone is becoming like the Kalashnikov was in the former era of national liberation struggles, the great equalizer. Because now all the technology in the skies that the imperialists use to dominate, you know, think about what they did to Iraq. Think about what they did to Afghanistan. You know, think about what they did to Yugoslavia. Overwhelming, Libya, overwhelming blitzkrieg from the skies, pulverize you into dust before they ever send a boot on the ground, right? Now, of course, even in those scenarios, the imperialists were finding that boots on the ground didn't get them the stability they wanted. As soon as they put a boot on the ground, the boots face other boots, and then there's a problem, right? But they can pulverize your society from the sky with impunity. And that overwhelming firepower and the threat of that firepower kept a lot of people in line for a long time. And now it's like, okay, so what we're seeing is a combination of tunnels and drone knowledge enables you to essentially level this very unlevel playing field to the point where all of the advantages that the imperialists thought they had suddenly become disadvantages. Suddenly, because if it takes them a year to produce, I don't know how long it takes to produce a drone, so I haven't looked into it, but it's going to take X amount of time. They don't produce that many. They're hugely expensive, and you can shoot them down with a missile that costs you $2,000, then that's unsustainable. You've got loads of those missiles. They can't keep up with your production. The whole thing doesn't work. And we saw this with the Iranian retaliation to Israel last month. With all of those drones that they flew, they were old technology. They were slow. They weren't difficult to detect, but they were incredibly expensive to shoot down. What did I hear? That between them, the USA, Britain, and Israel all mobilized everything they had that night to stop Israel from being pulverized by all these drones which were coming. In the process, they revealed all of their air defenses. But more than that, they spent on using F-35s and all of their missiles and expensive anti-aircraft systems and all the rest of it, air defense systems. They spent $3.5 billion in one night. Now that is you have to do that lots of times in a row, and that's a very quick path to bankruptcy, right? And it's also a path to an empty arsenal, right? These aircraft carriers, again, they have a certain amount of air defense. They use them all, then they have to move and just get out of the way, because otherwise they're going to be at the bottom of the sea. And how many hundreds of millions of dollars go with them? These were supposed to project American power around the world, but instead what they're doing is highlighting US imperialist weakness, that the technological playing field is not what it was in 1991. And again, it's a genie that's out of the bottle. It's not going back. Look at Gaza. Yes, Israel can commit the most horrific atrocities. It can terrorize 2 million civilians who are on the surface without the protection of air defense systems. Well done. But every part of the strip that they pulverize is still underlaid by the tunnels of the resistance, who are still fighting. And every time an Israeli boot goes into any part of Gaza, those boots are getting blown up. The tanks, the armored vehicles, the troops who go in, the troops don't dare get out of their armored vehicles because they think they're safer in them. And you see video after video of some, resistance fighter in his t-shirt carrying a little weapon, goes running out of a tunnel, runs across, attacks it to a tank, runs back again, some guy with him filming it, boom. And this is the reality of the war. When it comes to actually fighting, Israel cannot win, even with all of the devastation and destruction. Okay, it's razed Gaza to the ground. It's doing its best to raise the people also. But I genuinely don't think it's physically capable of doing what it would like to do, which is destroy all of those people. It's not possible for that to happen. They're destroying a lot, and it's horrific and horrible to watch. But in the process, they're destroying themselves far faster, actually, than they're destroying Palestinians.
And they're destroying the U.S. empire. No, excuse me. They're not destroying the U.S. empire. They are an element of the U.S. empire. And the imperialists, I think, are desperate because they understand that they have extended themselves. One of the things I talk about is empires contract, empires expand. They try to expand up to the Russian border. Ukraine is part of that expanse. And the Russians said, no, that's not going to happen. And they're being forced to contract. I think the big horror of the imperialists, the U.S. empire, the big fear of them is that basically an argument that we can do anything we want, nobody can stop us. right? Nobody can stop us. Anything we want, any way we want. We control the narrative. We control everything. And here's one of the things we're going to do. We expand as we please. The discussion about Ukraine is any country can join anything they want. Well, not in South America. We have the Monroe Doctrine, and that says no one in South America can do anything we don't. We tell them our entire hemisphere. If we say you can't do it, you can't do it. However, Ukraine can be a member of anything. They're a democratic organization country. They can do whatever they want to, which means we can take Ukraine and we can expand up to the Russian. It's really not about Ukraine. It's saying the U.S. empire can expand anywhere in the world as it pleases, and no one has a say in it. And the Russians first challenged that rhetorically and said, no, you can't do it. And now the U.S. had to take Ukraine. We have to now prove that we are the empire that rules the world, and we can come up to the Russian border. So that's the rhetorical discussion. Can the empire expand anywhere in the world as it pleases or not? The U.S. empire says yes. The Russians say no. That's the desperation. Now, the Russians say, well, then we got to figure this out. We can't do it with discussion. There's only one way to do this, and we're going to physically stop you on our border. So now the question is being answered. And the question is, no, you can't. That's the answer. You can't. Maybe you could at one time, but you can't now. And the desperation of the empire is once it's exposed, once that question is answered, can we do anything we want in the world anytime we want? And now that the answer is no, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. The rest of the world looks at it and says, well, you can't come to our area. Well, you can't come you can't come to Taiwan. Well, you can't come to Africa. And now we look in Africa, we look around the world. I think as a result of that question being answered in Ukraine, the empire is starting to contract, and it's being forced, and they know it ain't going to stop it contracting. Got a couple more minutes. Your thoughts on that?
It's definitely not going to stop contracting, Garland. You and I have talked about this a few times. You know that this is a culmination of a historical process that's been going on since World War I. The decline of the system of imperialism has been ongoing for a century, and we are now in, I would say, we're looking at the denouement of that process, because the last surviving strong imperialist power is now becoming weak at the core. It has become weak. That's a process that's been ongoing actually since the 70s, but now we are seeing it really come to fruition, that at the core it is characterized by bankruptcy, by economic crisis. That it is, we have to understand this war drive. It's not a kind of like, oh, it's an empire, it just has to expand. This is a function of economic crisis. Because of the crisis, the inability of the imperialists to keep making profits, because of glutted markets, because of the impoverishment of the masses, the drive to try to find ways to maintain profitability has become desperate. And how do you do that? You do that by conquering markets and subjugating them. You do that by war as a business, right? By destroying things on such a scale that they need rebuilding, and that revives your markets for a while, right? And you do it by conquering territories and looting them rather than trading with them for their raw materials. So you get super profits through loot. Imperialism is a system of global looting. That's how you get such big profits from it, right? It's a way of maintaining profitability through looting rather than buying and selling. Right? You want the raw materials at the cheapest possible price, and just what Russia will sell you its energy for versus how much profit you would get from that energy if you were just there, just taking it. That difference is what really impels the imperialists, right? Because their system is dying without that injection. Without the injection of a collapsed and looted Russia, a collapsed and looted China, imperialism's heading off a cliff right now. It is heading into economic crisis from which it cannot extract itself other than through massive wars and massive destruction of already existing wealth, massive destruction of means of production, massive destruction of livelihoods and infrastructure, massive destruction of people who they talk about as useless eaters, right? They can't give them jobs. Why can't they give them jobs? Because they can't sell the stuff they've already made. Why can't they sell the stuff they've already made? Because they made the people too poor to buy it. You know, they're in a downward spiral they can't get out of. And everything they try to do to get out of it makes it worse, because all the measures to try to keep the rich rich inflict further poverty on the poor. And what does that mean ultimately? Ultimately, when you inflict more poverty on the poor, you're making your market for your goods smaller. The poorer the poor get, the less stuff they can buy. So every day, when the ruling class is trying to keep itself above water by pushing the burden of the crisis onto the poor, they're making the situation worse. They're making the crisis deeper. They're making the explosion that's coming bigger. Right? And that's what you have to understand about the whole thing. It's driven by economic crisis, this desperate drive to war. And, you know, this crisis of profitability, then it's leading to, as we said, economic crisis, political crisis follows from that, you know, and the whole system, we suddenly see a lot of things which have been simmering below the surface for a long time now come into the open. You know, when it's like the you know, rats on the sinking ship. You know, when things are going badly, the people at the top start fighting amongst themselves, and the more bad they get, the more they're fighting with one another. So we're witnessing all of this, and as workers, we have to take the message. We have to learn the lessons that are being taught to us. Imperialism cannot provide for the working classes, cannot give us the benefit of the huge wealth that humanity has at its disposal. We have the capability, we have the technology to provide a really decent, really cultured, peaceful, beautiful, dignified existence with education and healthcare and all the benefits of the wonderful technologies that humanity in all its creativity and ingenuity has produced. We have the ability to live in a world where we all benefit from those things, with useful work to do, on a planet that's taken care of. You know, all of that is possible, but it's not possible while imperialism continues to exist. And we have to recognize that, you know, it's capitalism is imperialism. Imperialism is capitalism gone global. You know, it's socialism is the only way to break out of this Gordian knot that's getting tighter and tighter around the necks of the people of the world, in fact. And understand the lesson that the crisis is trying to teach us.
Joti Brar, where can people find you online? Where can people follow all your good works?
So I'm at thecommunists.org. That's my party's website. Good news and analysis that you won't get other places. We are the Communists on Telegram. Joti Brar, that's me. I am on Telegram. I have my own very exciting channel. You can see a few of my ramblings there and things that I like to share. We have a YouTube channel called Proletarian TV. Yeah, that's about it, I think.
Wonderful, wonderful. And of course, Garland Nixon here. And you know where to find me. I'm on Telegram at GarlandN. I'm on Facebook, and email garlandn@gmail.com. I do answer emails. People email me every day, and I answer the ones that make sense. Every now and then you get a little weird email, but yeah, you know, that's part of the game, right? And but follow Joti and share this on all your social media platforms. As you know, I'm not on X. You know, want to hear something interesting? So before we go, I'll tell you this, just to show you how crazy these people are. A year ago, X decided that they couldn't figure out who I am. You know, they sent a letter to garlandn@gmail.com. The email that they had been for years contacting about a Twitter account that's at Garland Nixon, right? So they took $84, which is 1 year at $8 a month, if they give you a little break, right? So they gave me a year. They took $84 out of my account. A month later, they sent me an email that says, you know, we really can't figure out who owns this account, Garland, at Garland Nixon, that was paid for out of a bank account of Garland Nixon, that we're emailing garlandn@gmail.com. We really don't know who owns this account. We'll keep the money, but I'm sorry, feel free to open another account, but this one's really confusing. We're not sure who owns this right now. So this one's, you know, we'll just this account that has a little blue check mark that says verified, right? So this is a year ago. I paid for a year. And I said to a lot of people, I said, I'm going to take legal action. They said, well, what are you waiting for? I just received something from Twitter again. You know what it is?
What?
The bill for next year.
Renewal.
They're renewing the account at Garland Nixon that they have no idea who owns it. Therefore, I can't access the account. They just sent me a bill. They're going to charge me for another year for the account
To be verified.
that somebody else owns, that I previously paid for, that they can't figure out who owns. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pay the bill. And then I will be in a position to act. But at any rate, isn't that interesting? They don't know who owns it. They have no clue. But somehow I guess they figured I'm doing charitable work for whoever this Garland Nixon person is. And it's interesting. First, they send me an email that says, "Dear garlandin@gmail.com, you need to change your password because your account has been compromised." So I put the information in and they're like, come to think of it, we don't even know who owns this account. Clearly, it's not you. And I'm like, well, you sent me an email asking me to change my password. Why would you send me an email to an account if you don't know who owns it? So I've got to pay again for this account that I don't know who owns.
I'm looking forward to the outcome of this battle.
Makes it a little more difficult for them to make that argument, doesn't it?
That's right.
But we got to take them by their word. They don't know who owns it. They're unable. They are selling a service that they're unable to provide by their own admission, unless they just come out and say, well, no, we're lying, we really did that, which again causes another problem. At any rate, thank you very much, Joti. I'm having fun with Twitter. I've been waiting for a year for this, and now it looks like they're going to do exactly what I predicted that they were going to do. They're going to charge me another year, and I'm going to pay it. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Joti Brar, everyone. Hey, we're out.